Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here. My guest now is Andrew Klavan. Andrew Klavan is host of the very popular Andrew Klavan podcast at the Daily Wire, which is a great website in and of itself. And he's the screenwriter of Gosnell, that powerful movie about the doctor who killed so many babies. And, of course, a best-selling author. He teaches the newest video from PragerU, Who Needs Feminism? 2 million views in 2 days, over 8,000 comments, every one of them positive. That was a joke. Andrew Klavan, I'm curious, do you read comments? I do.
You know, I glance at them. I try to stay away from the really toxic ones because who needs it? But I will look at any intelligent, well-reasoned comment.
Well, you don't know they're well-reasoned until you look at them, so you can't avoid the toxic ones.
The first four-letter word.
I see. It's funny. I am transfixed by the people who curse people like you or me, and I have this fantasy that I could meet them. And the first thing I want to ask them is, are they married and do they have children? I never imagine a married person with children writing a series of expletives as a commenter on the internet.
To me, it raises the immediate question. They disagree with me, and I disagree with them, but only they are cursing and yelling. Why is that? Why am I feel they are just as wrong as they feel I am wrong. Why are they the only ones screaming and yelling? I'm sure you go to universities, it's the conservatives who keep their mouths shut. It's not just because they're outnumbered. It's because the other side doesn't argue with them. It just shouts them down and insults them. It's a very strange phenomenon. It doesn't occur to them. The very fact that they're screaming and cursing at you indicates that they may not have a good argument.
One would think that, wouldn't one? I wrote a theory that I have for this answer in my column yesterday. Leftists, unlike liberals and conservatives, do not believe that they are bound by the laws of civility or what I call middle-class values as the rest of the civilization. Any thought?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true because their entire philosophy is that they are taking a moral stance. And if your stance is moral, then it stands to reason anyone who disagrees with you is immoral or evil. And I don't think that conservatives think that. I think we sort of agree that there are moral rules, moral ways to go, and we're trying to design the best systems to get to them. When somebody says that he's a socialist because he wants life to be more fair and he doesn't want people to starve, I also want life to be more fair and I don't want people to starve. I think capitalism works better and maintains freedom in doing that. At least we're arguing about something where we both agree on the values. But leftists basically think their values are the values and everything else is hatred.
That's right. So your thesis here is that feminism has been a destructive force.
Completely. And it's fascinating to me in the angry letters that I'm getting how many of them say that I said that women should be restricted in their opportunities and choices, which I do not believe.
No, it's not even hinted at. It's amazing to celebrate the idea that motherhood is important is obscene in their eyes. That's right.
And those are my two biggest the two biggest reasons I oppose feminism is one, it's premised on the lie that men and women are the same. So if we make different choices and we have different outcomes and we have different professional lives, different pay levels, it must be because of oppression, because we're the same, right? So how could it be due to anything else? And in fact, that's simply not true. All of science, all logic, all observation shows that it's not true. The differences between men and women mean they make different choices in their lives when they're set free, and they're going to have different outcomes. So that's the first thing. It makes people angry because it starts with a lie, and it makes them think things are unjust when they're just different. People are just different. But the thing that really bugs me about feminism, more than anything else, is not what it says about men. Obviously, it's always screaming and yelling about men. But to be honest with you, Dennis, I don't care what they say about me because I don't respect them and I don't really believe them. It's what they say about women. It's what they say about the typical beliefs and feelings and desires and dreams of women. They run them down. Just what you said, that motherhood, homemaking, relationship should not come first in a woman's life. I'm not saying it should. Make your own choice. I'm just saying that by observation and by science, you see that it does a lot of times. And why should feminists tell women that that's wrong? It is essentially telling them that their inner nature is somehow defective and only the goals, the natural goals and desires.
All right, we're going to come back in a moment. Andrew Klavan, his video is up on feminism at PragerU. All right, my friends, you're listening to the Dennis Prager Show. I've had Andrew Klavan on. He's gone for now, but we'll get him back hopefully. Here is a typical response to his video for PragerU. PragerU comes out with a video every week, a 5-minute video. And he's a serious thinker at Daily Wire, where he has a very popular podcast. So a lot of the comments say things like, "I can't believe I watched this video. It made me sick." But they don't tell, in the vast majority of cases, they don't explain why it made them sick. You see, for people on the left, that's enough because it's feelings based. So if it made them sick, that is definitionally sufficient to invalidate the video. So we have Andrew back. I think I don't know. I think he went for a vodka and tonic or something. I'm not quite sure. But we got you back, Andrew. I'm not hearing Andrew. So we'll hear him in a moment. I suspect he hears me and is now engaged in a bit of frustration. Are you there now?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. Yes.
There. Yeah.
So I was reading while you were off the line, saving telephone costs, and I understand the Daily Wire is struggling, and
it's very tough and tight here. Right?
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, you only have 72 million subscribers there, and it's. So here is a typical comment. "I can't believe I watched this video. It made me sick." They don't tell why it made them sick, and I was saying while we were getting you back, for most people on the left, being made sick is sufficient. One does not have to explain why one is made sick.
Yes, it's absolutely right. This is the thing. I mean, we're watching this obviously unfold with the Kavanaugh debate. Is this powerful, emotive energy? This idea that if you start screaming, if you start weeping, if you feel bad, that something must be wrong, and that's just not true. It just isn't factually true, and it's a very strange reaction to take too, because it raises again this question. I disagree with you. I'm not sick. Why do my ideas make you sick, but yours don't make me sick? It just in and of itself points to the fact that something must be wrong.
Well, and as I said, it's so feelings based. But I really would like to know what made. Again, I want to interview these people. I mean it. My listeners know I'm serious. They're all anonymous. But if somebody said, and I'm contactable at the following email address, I think we would contact them. I remember when I wrote a piece, one of my columns years ago, saying it's titled "When a wife or when a woman is not in the mood," suggesting that if you love your husband, you might on occasion not let mood alone determine whether you have relations with him, because it's so important to most husbands and it's such a loving thing to do. So the Daily Kos attacked me for advocating marital rape. And the Huffington Post did this past week. They did it on the same column from 10 years ago. Prager, who has advocated marital rape. Go on.
It's this line the left uses. You can hear it in interviews again and again. what you're saying is. So you say, I'm opposed to feminism. I think it's oppressive. And they say, well, what you're saying is women can't work. You
right.
say, no, that's
right.
not what I'm saying. You say that it would be loving, to have sex with your husband, even if you're not entirely in the mood. What you're saying is men should be able to rape their wives. And you just think, well, wait, what machine did what I say go through where it came out hateful and awful? And it's because they had that assumption, that binary assumption that there's their opinion and there's hate. I mean, Dennis, think of the way they argue the most absurd things. For a million years, people say, oh, there are men and women. And then one day, that becomes hateful. It's not like somebody says to you, there are some men who have kind of very feminine traits and they feel uncomfortable in their bodies. And you say, I can understand that. That could happen. They say, well, some women have penises. Get over it or you're hateful. How can you have that debate? How can you have that conversation?
Well, that's right. And I just wanted to add that one who said that I engage in that was a woman named Jezebel on the internet, and I did have her on the show. The woman who charged me, I'm not joking when I would say I'd like to interview the people who attacked you, who got sick from watching a 5-minute video. I have a question for you. On a broader issue, as it were, if there is a resurgence, and I think there is, of conservatism in the United States, tell me, and you're totally free to say, well, I see what you're saying, but I don't agree with you or whatever. It seems to me that it is disproportionately located in Southern California.
A resurgence of conservatism. Well, I think that this is the place where, in order for conservatism to be heard at all in Southern California, it has to speak quite loudly, right? We are vastly outnumbered, and the government and the press and the movie industry is all here, and it's all making one sound. It's all singing one note again and again. And I think that over time causes people to come together and start speaking out. I mean, on one block in the Valley, there's so many conservative.
Well, look, let's tell people that you with the Daily Wire and your podcast and Ben Shapiro's podcast and Prager University and there's PJ Media. I mean, they're all located within miles of each other. So I just think people around the country would find that interesting. Listen, you do great work, Andrew. It is a joy to be with you and to have your video at PragerU.
It's an honor to be on PragerU, Dennis. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So you can catch that, of course, at PragerU.com.
The Dennis Prager Show, live from the Relief Factor Pain-Free Studio.
I am an anti-feminist. Feminism is a mean-spirited, small-minded, and oppressive philosophy that can poison relations between the sexes, relations which for most of us provide some of life's deepest pleasures and consolations. Feminism has attempted to bully us all into accepting an obvious lie, the lie that men and women have the same powers, talents, proclivities, and desires, and that consequently any discrepancy in their professional paths is due to bigotry and must be corrected by force of culture and law. By shoving that lie down our throats, feminism has made both men and women less happy and less free. Now, I'm going to have to speak in generalities, and I understand there are all kinds of exceptions to what I'm about to say. But the generalities remain generally valid. Feminism denigrates masculinity in men by relentlessly calling us toxic for our flaws rather than appreciating our natural qualities of energy, risk-taking, and leadership. But it also denigrates femininity in women, working to replace most women's commitment to relationship and child-rearing with male obsessions, such as career status and strength. What's the result? Take a look at the quintessential feminist icon, Rosie the Riveter, flexing her muscle. The truth is, any man of the same size and fitness can make a bigger, stronger muscle than Rosie can. By herding women away from their feminine natures, feminism seeks to transform them from first-rate women into second-rate men. Now, perhaps you'll protest. Isn't feminism simply the idea that women have the same human rights as men? No, it isn't. That philosophy is called classical liberalism, which holds that we are all equally endowed by God with the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But wait, doesn't the Declaration of Independence say that all men are created equal? Yes, classical liberalism was an idea conceived by and largely for Christian white men. But, like all ideas, good and bad, classical liberalism has evolved over time according to its internal logic, so it now includes all races and both sexes. Good job, Christian white men. Thanks for the great idea. As its excuse for the damage it does to our lives, feminism has developed the historical mythology that men have oppressed women and now must be suppressed in their turn to even things out. Let me propose a different narrative that has the advantage of possibly being true. Insofar as men and women are physical creations, their central purpose is the production of more human beings. Women are therefore fashioned in body and mind to make and nurture children, and men to protect and support those children during their relatively long maturation period. All societies shape themselves around these necessities. They created structures that formalized gender roles and attempted to ensure the paternity of children so that men would care for their own. In many societies, these structures became increasingly ritualistic and oppressive for women. But the opposite happened in the Christian West. Why? Take a look at your Bible, Proverbs 31. The biblical ideal of a good woman is not only strong, kind, and wise, she's also a creative and economic dynamo. Christianity sanctified motherhood in the person of Mary and celebrated women's fortitude and virtue in the female saints. The Church created a version of marriage intended to protect women and designed the philosophy of chivalry, which instructed men to use their superior strength for women, not against them. Individuals can be incredibly abusive to one another, men and women both. But over time, Christendom tended to elevate, protect, and ultimately include women as women in the great enterprise of Western civilization. Now, the developments of modernity have created special challenges for women. Industry removed clothing and food production from the home to the factory, and thus deprived homemakers of their traditional businesses. Children lost their monetary value to parents by leaving home to fend for themselves. So, while motherhood and homemaking remain the most important spiritual activities of humankind, modernity has stripped those enterprises of their former economic power. But, in a Western civilization dedicated to equal rights, these challenges come along with fresh opportunities. New technologies and effective birth control allow individual women to tailor gender roles to their personal liking or abandon them altogether. None of this is a reason to attack men. In fact, these new opportunities are largely the result of men's inventions and their ideas. And none of it requires women to abandon the femininity which is one of the graces of our world. It's just change and progress, that's all. With honest thought and goodwill, we can adapt over time without the angry, bitter, and dishonest attacks on our human nature by feminists. I'm Andrew Klavan for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
There's a myth that I've grown up with, that the European war in the spring of 1945, after the Battle of the Bulge, the winter and the spring, was anticlimactic, that the Germans basically just surrendered, and after they spent their efforts trying to repel the invasion at D-Day, and then one last splurge of an offense in the Battle of the Bulge, that they basically folded. Nothing could be further from the truth, as is illustrated in a wonderful, page-turning thriller of a history book called Guns at Last Light by Rich Atkinson. The fact is that the German resistance, once we crossed the Rhine into Germany, was horrific. There were some units that surrendered, and there were some that ran away, but the Allies lost more soldiers in April of 1945, 1 month before Hitler committed suicide, than in June of 1944, when they stormed out the beach at Omaha and fought in Normandy. More men. about 80,000 deaths, American combat deaths, took place in Europe in that horrific year between D-Day and the surrender, American combat deaths. And it was a bloody, terrible period, a difficult slog, because the German resistance was stiff, it didn't just fold, and they fought like hell. It began when, after D-Day, everybody breathed a sigh of relief because we had landed. We went into the hedgerow country in Normandy. And those are these high hedges that are taller than a man. And you can't see through them, and you can't see over them, and you can't see around them. And the fields in Normandy are pockmarked with these hedgerows. And we found it an impossible field to fight in. You had to go bit by bit by bit and destroy all the German fortifications. And it was very hard to do. We ultimately couldn't do it. And what we decided to do was a massive saturation carpet bombing centered on the town of Saint-Lô, L-O, right in the middle of this region, where we literally obliterated everything in massive, massive bombing concentrated in a very small area. And then we were able to walk through and come back and envelop the Germans who were still fighting at the beachhead. Then we splurged and decided to go for a quick knockout of Germany by conquering Holland and then going across to Berlin. But that was an ill-conceived effort by Montgomery, called Market Garden. It's commemorated in the movie A Bridge Too Far, and it was an abject failure by the Allies. Then we worked hard at opening the port of Antwerp, because we needed a port to be able to supply the huge logistical needs of the army in Europe. And we took Antwerp easily enough, but the surrounding area was a vicious, bitter fight that lasted for months before we could finally open the port. Then the Germans hit us with the Battle of the Bulge, where they threw all of their resources, 80% of their fuel production went into the Western Front to try to break out. And barely after containing that, we then crossed the Rhine, and then the real fighting started, with the German resistance, town by town, city by city. When I say town by town, they were really rubble by rubble, because we had destroyed these towns. But read Rich Atkinson's book, Guns at Last Light, and you'll find it just fascinating, and it will debunk a lot of myths we hold about the war. Thanks for watching.
Lately, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of concern about the big social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, which is owned by Google and so forth, imposing either outright bans or so-called shadow bans on conservative and libertarian thinkers, right? Closing their accounts for making politically incorrect remarks, or adjusting the algorithm that these platforms use to display stories in a certain order and so forth, so that people are less likely to see posts from individuals and groups that are thought to be, politically suspect. If you do a Google search, even Trump alleges that, right, if you search for Donald Trump on Google, Google has either designed the algorithm in such a way, or there are people explicitly coding it such a way that, Stormy Daniels is the #1 hit or whatever if you search for Donald Trump. Lou Rockwell even mentioned in his remarks yesterday that companies like PayPal have refused to deal with, websites and publishers and so forth, who have kind of sort of disreputable ideas. And there's the whole crusade emphasized over the last few months about fake news and how it's the responsibility of Facebook and Twitter and other social media firms to weed out the fake news. Of course, what is fake news? Well, the usual definition of fake news is, news not approved by the state, right? And the established media companies and so forth. So there's a lot of pressure on technology firms to put policies in place that make sure that only sort of approved opinions get out and are seen by people and so forth.
Some of you may have seen, it was about 3 weeks ago, I think, I believe it was Breitbart, produced or shared a leaked video of an all-hands meeting at Google a few days after the 2016 election, or the first one of their company-wide meetings that took place after the election, with all of the top executives at Google, including the founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, crying, and people were sort of, singing "We Shall Overcome" and so forth, as people expressed their sorrow and how hurt they were about the election results and so forth. There was one survey of political opinions among Google employees suggesting that those who identified as conservative or libertarian, felt highly uncomfortable sharing their views with their colleagues, as you can imagine. And you remember the incident from 2017 where an engineer at Google named James Damore published an internal memo, I think it was called Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, complaining that there was a lack of viewpoint diversity within Google on issues not just related to politics, but on issues such as gender diversity in the workplace, and that it was harmful to Google professionally that there was only sort of one official view that was allowed on these kind of social issues, and that it would be better for the firm, better for creativity and so forth, if there were a little bit more diversity of opinion. Of course, then that memo was outed, and he was abruptly fired by Google, in what was kind of a PR blow for Google, at least among people like us, right? And even when I was looking the other day for checking the date on that, most of the news articles refer to him as, the anti-diversity guy who wrote an anti-diversity screed. I mean, it wasn't an anti-diversity screed. It was actually a pro-diversity argument if we mean diversity of opinion, right? He said, well, maybe we ought to think in other ways about why there are relatively few female engineers in Silicon Valley. Maybe it's something other than the patriarchy. Maybe there are other explanations we should explore, but that is described in the media as an anti-diversity stance. Okay, so how can we explain this? How can an industry that is such a great driver of capitalist growth and progress be staffed by people who have such anti-capitalist views? How can we explain that? Well, I mean, first, keep in mind that if we're talking about the social media companies, right, they maybe are better understood not as technology firms per se, but as media companies. Right now, the New York Times is also a very large private for-profit company. The Washington Post, of course, is owned by Amazon, owned by Jeff Bezos, right? So it's not at all surprising that many large, profitable for-profit enterprises take a very socialist, left-wing, anti-capitalist stance. I mean, we see that in the traditional media. And this has been, there are many explanations offered over the years. Great social theorists like Joseph Schumpeter and F.A. Hayek have pointed out that when you look at the media, universities, other kind of the publishing industry, and many sort of public intellectuals, the reason that they're so left-wing is not because smart, articulate people tend to be on the left, but because of a kind of a selection bias that smart and capable people who are kind of uncomfortable with markets and commerce, who like to tell other people what to do, right, tend to select into academia, into journalism, into the media, and so forth, whereas equally smart and capable and articulate people who are comfortable with the world of affairs tend to self-select into business and tend to be pro-capitalism and be in the capitalist sector, where we don't see them as much, right? Because their job is not to stand up in front of people and talk, but rather to make goods and services and to make the world a better place. Of course, when you are in the universities or you're in the journalism industry, it's to your advantage to be friendly toward the state, to support the government. Murray Rothbard, of course, wrote about this on many occasions, this kind of unholy alliance between public intellectuals who provide sort of legitimacy and justification for the state, in exchange for which they get access, they get privilege, they get special protection, they get public funding and subsidies and so forth. So we shouldn't be surprised that, to the extent that Facebook and Twitter and so forth are media companies, that their personnel have the same kind of ideology as other media companies, namely an anti-capitalist kind of a view. And of course, there's also a lot of what we might call confirmation bias among media types, right? They interpret events when they look at what's going on, the hearings in the Senate in the last couple, U.S. Senate in the last couple of days. Hardly anybody in the established media or in these new media companies is, kind of trying to report on the facts of what happened in order to establish some kind of truth or discover the facts of what took place 25 or 30 years ago, right? Everything is interpreted to fit into a preconceived narrative, right? And depending on what your preconception is, you describe these events in a way that reinforces your particular ideology. Okay, but what about tech companies specifically? Right? Why are Amazon and Apple and Microsoft and firms like that? Why are their executives and employees? Why do they tend to have this particular ideology? I mean, let's keep in mind that these are private, for-profit companies. Okay, whatever you feel about Twitter or Facebook, I mean, their assets are owned by investors, shareholders. These are private companies. Their business is to make profits by providing goods and services to consumers. And of course, these companies have created tremendous value for human beings, right? For consumers, for humanity, in the last few decades. So there's no doubt about that. But of course, we don't live in a pure capitalist economy. We don't live in a free market society. We live in a mixed economy in which many firms can become large and influential, not merely by providing goods and services that people want, but also by kind of cozying up to the state, right? And of course, we know from history. Patrick talked yesterday about his work editing Rothbard's book on the progressive era. Right? Throughout history, many big business people have not been pro-market, but have been pro-subsidy, pro-privilege, in a way that benefits themselves. So we shouldn't be surprised that large, wealthy, profitable companies can be staffed by people who are not pro-market. And again, I think the social media companies are like media companies in that they don't want to offend the powers that be. A good example is Google, has allegedly is working closely with government officials in China to make sure that Google kind of enables the sort of censorship that is common in China in order to gain access to that market. You might remember the whole thing in big issue in 2016 where the FBI wanted Apple to unlock an iPhone to be able to provide some information about a criminal case. And Apple CEO Tim Cook made a big deal of opposing the FBI on these grounds. That kind of stuff is just a sham, right? That's theater. That's political theater. In reality, the tech companies work very closely with the NSA and the CIA and the FBI and other government and their equivalents around the world to, partner with law enforcement in an appropriate manner to make sure that no one can use their technologies for, inappropriate purposes. Again, as Patrick pointed out, when we look at the progressive era, right, many of the rules and regulations that were allegedly designed to protect consumers and the public from harmful big businesses were really, written by and designed by those big businesses directly in order to protect them against their younger, smaller competitors. I was really struck by a couple of scenes earlier this year when, they had those hearings in the U.S. Congress and they made Mark Zuckerberg appear before Congress and explain what Facebook is doing to get, to keep out the Russian bots and so forth, make sure the Russians don't steal the election for Trump. And at one point, Zuckerberg said, look, there's a real danger in allowing the government to have influence on, information channels. And then just a few moments then he pointed out, and we, Facebook, we're not a small company. We're a large, dominant firm. It's relatively easy for us to work with you, Congress, to meet your rules and restrictions But it's much harder for smaller, younger companies like Facebook once were. And so Zuckerberg, he's basically stating the thesis that Rothbard emphasized, right? That regulation often helps big businesses at the expense of smaller businesses. So hence big business typically favors regulation that imposes more costs on younger and smaller rivals than on big business itself. And then 10 minutes later in the hearing, he says to another congressperson, we at Facebook would be delighted to work with you in designing the rules that will govern cyberspace, to make sure we get rid of fake news. Well, did nobody pick up on the sort of juxtaposition between those two remarks? Okay, so what does government do to help the technology sector? Why would tech firms have a more favorable opinion of government than they otherwise would? Well, I mean, in some cases it's obvious, right? There's some obvious cases of cronyism. Elon Musk comes to mind, right? So let's put that aside because that one's too obvious. There are more subtle ways in which government intervention helps these companies. There's intellectual property protection, right? So most software products are copyrighted. Other technologies, hardware relies heavily on the patent system. So in a world of a different kind of intellectual property regime, there might be different business models that these firms would need to use, and which might be much more costly for them. There's the internet itself, which the origins of which owes a lot to government intervention. Right, the internet evolved out of the so-called ARPANET, which was a Defense Department project from the 1960s and 1970s. I wrote an article in the Free Market many years ago called "Government Did Create the Internet, but the Free Market Made It Glorious," which got a lot of downloads, a lot of hits on Mises.org, arguing that, the government did play a big role in the development of the internet, but that kind of was harmful rather than helpful. The internet might be better today if it had not been for massive government subsidies. So I'm obviously not making a claim like the one associated with the British academic Mariana Mazzucato, who says, well, we really owe the government a big word of thanks for the development of technology, and therefore we need more regulation and more subsidies and so forth. I'm making the opposite claim. The government has had a big impact in helping some technologies and technology companies, but to the detriment of the overall working of the system. But another one piece of intervention that's not talked about very much is a certain part of a 1996 law called the Communications Decency Act, which was sold to the public as a way of protecting, minors from harmful and abusive material online. But there was a little piece called Section 230. Now, the Communications Decency Act itself was struck down by the Supreme Court as being overly broad, but the Section 230 provision remains. It explicitly gives internet firms immunity for any kind of sort of, common law tort action like defamation or libel for material that is published on those platforms. Right. So in other words, if the New York Times publishes an article that is, defamatory towards Tom DiLorenzo, I mean, I know that's shocking to imagine. Tom DiLorenzo could potentially sue. He could sue for defamation. He could sue for libel or whatever. And the argument would be, well, the New York Times is a curated platform. I mean, maybe Patrick Newman wrote the article, but it was published in the New York Times, edited by the New York Times. So the New York Times is legally liable for the content of its publication. But Section 230 says that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so forth are not legally responsible for content that is on their platforms, right? So some people have interpreted this as a kind of a subsidy that allows social media firms made their business model more viable, allowed them to attract investment and other forms of capital that maybe they wouldn't have been able to attract if investors were concerned that they could be subject to big losses in litigation. And so the argument always was, well, the New York Times is, sort of constructed from the top down. We're just an open platform where anybody can post anything, so you can't hold us responsible for what people post. Well, if that's the case, then those companies cannot now be going through and removing fake news and banning certain authors and so forth. Well, now you're like the New York Times. Now you're curating. You can't simultaneously curate and be immune from responsibility for what is published, but that's what this legislation imposed.
A humanitarian crisis in the Americas. Shortages of food and medicine, fear of police and the government send millions of Venezuelans to seek refuge in nearby countries. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet just last month had to devalue its currency, dropping 5 zeros from the bolivar to try to slow runaway inflation and fleeing citizens. The United States is calling Venezuela a kleptocracy. That's a government with corrupt leaders using their power to exploit the people. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley said Venezuela's widespread corruption has unleashed instability, violence, and human misery. Venezuela and the United States, they've been at odds since the turn of the century. New reports that U.S. officials met with coup plotters within Venezuela's military will do little to heal a fractured relationship. VOA's Steve Reddish brings us up to date.
Ha llegado la hora de la recuperación económica y necesitamos.
August's apparent assassination attempt against President Nicolas Maduro punctuated a downward spiral of Venezuela's economy and society. After Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Maduro inherited a crumbling socialist economy that tipped further when oil prices crashed a year later. The government cut public spending, established price controls, and printed more money that became worth less and less by the day. Shortages of food and basic goods created a black market, often run by militias loyal to Maduro. Millions of Venezuelans fled out of hunger, fear, or both. Human Rights Watch estimates that 2.3 million Venezuelan refugees are scattered through the Americas. 1 million of them are in Colombia. 250,000 are in Ecuador, while Peru hosts nearly 400,000. Maduro consolidated power in 2017 with a violent crackdown on opponents, prompting a threat from the President of the United States.
We have many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option.
Maduro won another term as president in 2018. It was a widely discredited election that was boycotted by the opposition parties. The United States imposed new economic sanctions in response. Steve Reddish, VOA News.
Of the 2.3 million Venezuelans who have left the country since 2014, half have left in just the last 18 months. Most of the refugees are in 3 nearby countries, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. VOA Spanish service correspondent Celia Mendoza has been to see the refugees, and she's here with me to tell us their stories. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Greta.
What have you seen?
Well, it's a very, very difficult situation for Venezuelans. We have seen people that have walked and crossed Colombia from Cucuta all the way to Ecuador to be able to go to Peru to try to find medicines, food, and a future for their families. But also we have seen a lot of children, pregnant women that have gone through this journey, and that is evidence that things are not going well in Venezuela. We also have seen the help given by the international community, by the receptor countries. We have Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, even countries like Chile have offered help to all these people. And this is something very particular for the region. We haven't seen this movement of people ever in the region, and that is something the United Nations has compared with the crisis in 2015 in the Mediterranean, and that is something that definitely has not been forecast in terms of preparation by each of the countries in the Americas.
Is there 2 things? One is that, do you get a sense of horrible desperation on the part of the people who are living in Venezuela? That's the first question. And then these host countries who are receiving them, whether it's Colombia, Brazil, Peru, or Ecuador, are they feeling a real pinch in terms of having these refugees, and are their citizens getting upset because I'm sure that jobs, resources are in play?
Definitely. The people that we have seen in the borders are desperate. Many of them don't care if they have shoes on. They walk for days, and that is an evident picture of what is happening inside the country. But as you mentioned, it's definitely a sense of pressure by all the Ecuadorians, Peruvians, Colombians. We have seen march, and we have seen people that have reacted against Venezuelans. In Brazil, we have seen mobs of people going after Venezuelans. Just recently, we had a case where a Venezuelan was murdered by the people of Brazil after a crime was committed. And this shows the tension that is being building up, especially right now that we have a larger amount of Venezuelans moving out of the country. And that, as we have asked some of them, is result of the economic changes that the president has implemented in Venezuela.
Are they breaking up families, leaving some of their families behind so that, it's some leave in desperation, some are left behind for this hyperinflation, terrible situation in Venezuela?
Yes, we have seen men crying on the border. We spoke to a father who said, this T-shirt I have on me, and it had the picture of his wife and 3 children, is the only thing that I have from my family. I left because I need to feed them. I need to bring money to them. But it's definitely a separation of families that is becoming a rule in the Venezuelan families right now.
What a crisis. Anyway, Celia, thank you very much. Venezuela's Supreme Court in exile asked Venezuela's military and Interpol to arrest President Maduro to face trial on corruption and other charges. The Supreme Court is in exile because in 2017, Maduro threatened long jail sentences to any of the 33 justices appointed to the bench by the legislature. I spoke to Miguel Angel Martin, who is the exiled court's Chief Justice. When you left Venezuela, how did you get out of there?
I had to leave in a small motor launch from the Venezuelan coast. I rode the launch for 7 hours to a Caribbean island. Later on, I came to the United States.
Did your family go with you?
No, they left later on. Today, my wife and my children are free, thank God. However, my parents and my brothers remain in Venezuela.
What if you hadn't left Venezuela? What do you think would have happened?
I'd be in jail. One of my colleagues was detained for several months in a bathroom in a cell in a dungeon in Venezuela. It would have meant not only more suffering for my family, but it would have also precluded me from fighting for the return of freedom to my country.
Of the 33 justices, you said 3 are still in Venezuela. How are they being treated?
Out of the 3, we only have information about 1, who lives under restrictions. He was locked up in a dungeon, and I understand that now lives at home with restrictions. As for the other 2 justices, we have no knowledge of their status or their situation.
As I understand it, the Attorney General brought the case saying there was corruption on the part of Maduro in millions of dollars having to do with the construction company. Is that the case that you have sentenced him to prison for?
First, this was a public trial. It took place in the headquarters of the Colombian Congress, which lent its space to the Venezuelan judicial system. Through more than 5,000 pieces of evidence, it was demonstrated that Maduro received bribes from Odebrecht ombudsman. He also caused harm to the nation. As a result, we sentenced him to 18 years and 3 months in prison.
When was he sentenced to 18 years in prison? Just recently?
Yes.
And the prosecutor is the Attorney General who's in exile? She brought the case?
Yes. According to the Constitution of Venezuela, charges against those who serve as presidents of the Republic must be brought up by the Attorney General. In the case of Venezuela, she is in exile. These charges and these trials must be authorized by the Venezuelan Congress, which is in Venezuela. Following every step established by the law, we, in a public trial, not only declare that Maduro was guilty and that he must go to jail, but we also sentenced him to pay fines in the amount of $25 million for bribery. He must also reimburse Venezuela $35 billion. As a result of this trial, he is to be removed from office, which will result in a power vacuum. What I mean is, Nicolás Maduro is not the legitimate president of Venezuela, and as a result, he does not represent Venezuela. His signature has no value. He cannot sign any accords that may commit the Republic of Venezuela.
Who's behind the assassination attempt on Maduro? Do you know?
No, I don't know who is behind it or whether it's true or not. What has been proven, however, and I, as Chief Justice of Venezuela, have evidence of the fact that Maduro and his regime are part of a transnational criminal organization which implicates several countries and represents a growing threat to the region. His regime not only endorses drug trafficking finances terrorism in Venezuela. Dangerous groups such as FARC, ELN, the Syrian Republican Guard, and ISIS reside in Venezuela. Venezuela is part of their territory. What I mean is, these groups are not going to let power go, because behind Maduro, there is a band of criminals that threaten the region.
Well, you can't have the transition until Maduro's out. What's the plan to get Maduro out if you have one?
As President of the Supreme Court, my goal is to strip down the regime to reveal that it is an outlaw state, that Maduro, besides being corrupt, is not the legal president of Venezuela. As a result, I ask other countries not to have relations with Nicolás Maduro's regime. Instead, they should help crack down on his regime so that the rule of law and democracy return to Venezuela. All reconstruction plans will be implemented as soon as us, Venezuelans, return to our country.
Have you spoken to people in the Trump administration? And if you have, what help are you asking the Trump administration for?
Throughout his journey, what we've tried to do is create an awareness among the international community about what the ultimate goal of the Maduro regime is. Venezuela is both a bank and a mine. What they are seeking is to control political power in the region. We have given testimony of what is happening in Venezuela to the United States, as well as other governments that cherish and love peace. We have requested that we build alliances so that we can free Venezuela of the evil that engulfs it. It will be very difficult for Venezuela alone to overcome this great problem, because this isn't a problem of a dictatorship in one country. This goes far beyond. This is organized crime, where several countries take part, where drug traffickers are using terrorism to negatively impact the country. What we've asked the United States for, in the forums where we have been present, is help in freeing our country.
The New York Times recently reported that there were contacts between U.S. officials and coup plotters within Venezuela's military. According to that New York Times report, a disaffected Venezuelan general reached out to the Trump administration after hearing President Trump in 2017 threaten military action against Venezuela. In the end, the U.S. decided not to help those trying to overthrow Maduro, who has called the U.S. imperialist bent on getting rid of him. For a deeper perspective on the U.S. relationship with Venezuela, I am joined by Patrick Duddy, former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela from 2007 to 2010. He was then expelled from Venezuela in September 2008, but then President Hugo Chavez, who claimed the U.S. was plotting his overthrow. Duddy returned to Venezuela in 2009 to finish out his assignment. He is now the Director of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Duke University. Patrick Duddy joins us via Skype from Atlanta. Nice to see you, sir.
It's very good to be with you.
Sir, you have met President Maduro. What are your impressions of him?
Well, in the first instance, he's not nearly as charismatic as his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And I believe that particularly since 2013, he has become, first, increasingly desperate to hold on to power, and second, increasingly authoritarian.
Well, there was recently an attempt on his life, an assassination attempt. Any thoughts on that? Is that show a level of the dissension from within, or do you think that's outside influence?
The incident to which you refer, in which there was apparently a drone attack in the general vicinity of President Maduro, is still very unclear. And even the legitimacy of its being characterized as an attack is not entirely established. But there is lots of evidence that there is massive disaffection in Venezuela. As your earlier guests outlined, millions now of Venezuelans have left, and recent polling would suggest that given the means to do so, many millions more would leave absent a change at the top and a change in policy in Caracas.
Is there a way to describe the Trump administration policy towards Venezuela, and does it differ in any profound way from President Obama's administration or even President George W. Bush administration before that?
Well, the Trump administration has made very clear that its preference is for a peaceful solution, and they are relying primarily on diplomatic means to try and encourage an end to the crisis. They are, of course, meeting with a wide range of disaffected Venezuelans, but in doing so, they continue to emphasize their preference for a diplomatic solution, for the restoration of democracy, respect for human rights, and the opening of a channel for humanitarian assistance. That said, the government has taken more steps, including imposing some financial sanctions on the government of Nicolas Maduro, and in doing so, they have moved somewhat more aggressively than the earlier administrations.
Where do you, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but where do you think this is all heading?
Well, there's an ongoing debate among those of us who follow developments in Venezuela closely. And it seems to me there are sort of two visions. One is that, like, for instance, Zimbabwe of a decade or so ago, the country continues to spiral down, but doesn't necessarily explode. It simply, to use a kind of homely metaphor, it simply circles the drain perpetually, and the people live in increasing misery. The other is that there is some sort of social explosion, a la, for instance, 1989, and what is now known as the Caracazo, when there was major rioting all over the country in response to sort of an extreme economic crisis. I'm not sure which of the two is more likely, but the current circumstances appear to be unsustainable.
Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Not all Venezuelans are against President Maduro. Jesus Silva is among those who believe Maduro is honest and trying to end corruption. He is a doctor of constitutional law and hosts a show on Venezuelan state-owned TV. Jesus Silva joins us on Skype from Caracas. Nice to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Sir, what do you believe is the problem that is brewing in Venezuela? Who would you point your finger at?
I think that my country is fighting against international conspiracy. For instance, there is a man who says he is the Supreme Court Justice of Venezuela, but he is not. It's a fake justice. This individual actually is a fugitive of Venezuelan justice who was appointed in illegal procedure. So in this context, I must say that there is only one Supreme Court, which is based in Caracas, and it has 32 justices, members of the Supreme Court. So the allegations by this individual are completely unfounded. I must tell you that there are economic difficulties in my country, and the government is taking measures to solve such difficulties. For example, the new currency that is somehow mitigating the devaluation process that we have been suffering. But I must also remark that economic U.S. sanctions have been affecting our economy. It is not permitted for the Venezuelans to have access to U.S. currency for international transactions.
All right. Let me ask you a quick question. You caught my attention off the top. International conspiracy. Why would countries have an international conspiracy, any country, against Venezuela? What would be the motive?
The motive is that Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves So this is very attractive for many foreign governments and also foreign companies. So there is a clear attempt to overthrow our regime, our democratic regime, to overthrow our president in order to have rapid access to those oil reserves. In my view, it is completely unfair to demote the electoral processes in Venezuela if there is no evidence of fraud. Just a few months ago, President Nicolás Maduro was reelected with 7 million votes, around 7.
Is it fair to say? Is it fair to say there was some question about the election? You know, that the opposition thought that the fix was in for Maduro, so that they didn't vote. That they thought that the election was. You're talking about the May election. That the May election was an unfair one.
That's the point. The allegations against the electoral process that resulted in the re-election of Maduro are completely unfounded, because there were many opposition candidates running in this contest. They were defeated. They were defeated by Maduro, who got the majority. So there is no evidence of any fraud at all. According to international standards, the election was clean. The election was fair. There were witnesses of the election who came from other countries, and they watched the complete procedure that resulted to be the re-election of President Nicolás Maduro.
If your form of government works, if President Maduro is doing a good job, why does it seem that the country keeps deteriorating further and further and further, and any efforts that he's done to sort of turn it around, I guess in your view, have failed?
Because foreign sanctions against our economy are producing a negative result. Venezuelans have no possibility of international transactions with U.S. currency. And for good or for bad, the main currency in the Americas is the U.S. dollar currency. So in this context, it's very difficult for us to have access to buy medical products, to buy sound food. So we are under a terrible amount of political pressure and diplomatic pressure against us.
Sir, and with that, I've got to go, but I do appreciate joining us. I hope you come back, because I assume we're going to be talking a lot about this story.
Thank you.
Joining us, Gonzalo Kincaid, Chief of Staff to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. In May, the OAS found that it is reasonable to believe crimes against humanity have been committed in Venezuela. Nice to see you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get to the issue about crimes against humanity, our last guest, who supports President Maduro, says it's an international conspiracy and that a lot of the economic problems are the result of the sanctions against Venezuela. You respond how?
Venezuela is a dictatorship. Venezuela is the worst kind of dictatorship. It's a dictatorship that kills, that tortures, that starves its people, that have created the worst migration crisis in the Western Hemisphere recent history. And we can go on and on and on with the catalog of horrible things that have been caused by this regime directed by Maduro and his gang there. So, no, it is not foreign conspiracy. It is a dictatorship that is doing the worst things that we have seen done in this hemisphere.
In terms of what? I mean, what are they doing to their people? I mean, obviously we see the long lines, we see people leaving, so that's obviously a sign that, you know, things are, but specifically?
First, it is a dictatorship because people cannot vote. As you mentioned recently, elections in Venezuela are not fair, are not transparent.
They claim it was fair. They claim, you know, Maduro says the election was fair, and you say no, and I guess the international community says it was not fair.
The international community says it is not fair. Opposition leaders couldn't participate. You did not have international observation by electoral observation missions, by the OAS, the European Union, the bodies that usually observe elections. There is no separation of powers. The National Assembly cannot do its work. They have created Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, totally illegal, totally taking the functions and the powers of the National Assembly. I mean, it is a dictatorship because of that. It is a dictatorship because they have political prisoners. They have almost 300 political prisoners right now just because they think differently. They have political leaders in jail. You cannot say what you think in Venezuela if you're a political leader because you risk jail.
And what do you think? We had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in exile was just on our show, and they have sentenced President Maduro to 18 years of prison. What do you think Maduro's reaction when he hears that?
His reaction is not the central thing here, because the central thing here is in Venezuela you only have 3 democratic institutions that still remain. One, the National Assembly, voted by the people in 2015, December 2015. Second, the Tribunal Supremo de Justicia in the exile, which is the true and real Supreme Court of Justice, because it was elected by this National Assembly that was voted by the people. And 3, the General Prosecutor. Those are the only 3 institutions that remain democratic in the country. But we can go on and on with the catalog of things that this regime has committed against these people. We can go and explain about these crimes against humanity for which Maduro and the people that are part of his government should one day go to The Hague and be tried by the ICC.
What's the reaction from the neighboring community? You've got Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil. They're all getting refugees flowing into the country, and there's some coming into the United States and other nations. What is the impact on the neighboring countries?
It is a very, very, very concerning impact and devastating in some places. We have more than 2 million Venezuelans all around the region. We have a severe impact in Colombia, in Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and we can go on and on too at the same time. You mentioned the US. The regional community, the inter-American system is reacting. Countries have been very generous towards Venezuelans that are fleeing this regime. But at the same time, of course, no country alone can face this kind of situation, which is unprecedented. So we need regional coordination. We need coordination at the Organization of American States level in order for the countries to be able to receive these Venezuelan migrants that need support, that need help, that need to be integrated to the host country.
What started this? You've got Chavez came to power about 1998, but what started this recent sort of crisis that led to U.S. sanctions and all the problems that we see in Venezuela? Is it the ideology? Is it socialism? Is it dictatorship? What is it?
Like Secretary General Almagro said, the thing is, when you don't respect human rights, when you don't have democracy, when rule of law is not what prevails in the country, when arbitrary detentions and political prisoners are evidently there in the country, when you have the evidence on a reasonable basis that you have crimes against humanity, there you have a desperate people that cannot exert their rights, its rights. So they are starving. The economy is not working. Their political rights cannot be exerted. If the government wants, they send them to prison. If the government wants, once they are in prison, they torture them. If the government wants, they kill them. We have had extrajudicial killings in Venezuela. So it is a desperate people that needs to flee the regime. And it is caused by the lack of democracy, by corruption, by a government which is involved in drug trafficking and which is involved in criminal activities. When you have that, you have a disaster. When you have a disaster, you need solutions. What are the solutions? Yeah. Democracy, justice, rule of law, respect, and promotion of human rights. That's why Secretary General Almagro created this panel that produced a report, a 400-page report, where there is evidence about crimes against humanity committed by the regime in Venezuela. And it has been submitted to the International Criminal Court. I can leave you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Before we go, a reminder of the danger facing journalists in Venezuela. Jesus Medina was helping colleagues with the reporting project at a Caracas hospital. Medina was arrested on August 29th by agents of Venezuela's intelligence service. He has been charged with money laundering, which has been used previously by the Venezuelan government against journalists. And he's also been accused of violating a 2017 law against inciting hate in the media. Medina was previously detained in October 2017 while reporting at a prison. He said his kidnappers tortured him and threatened him with death. The Committee to Protect Journalists is calling for Medina's immediate release. That's all the time we have for today. You can now podcast this show and previous episodes of Plugged In on voanews.com. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta and follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.